All right, we are right at the top of the hour, so we're going to go on and get started. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We're excited to begin a new webinar series introducing ISO 27001, the only internationally recognized standard for managing an information security management system. Today we will be talking about what ISO 27001 is and how it can be used to improve your organization's information security and compliance management. A few housekeeping things before we begin. We welcome and encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can submit your questions using the Q&A feature that is located on the WebEx toolbar. And we have reserved some time at the end of today's session to answer any questions that come through. I'd like to give a brief background of who we are at KirkpatrickPrice in case this is your first time joining us for one of our webinars. KirkpatrickPrice is a licensed CPA firm specializing in information security and regulatory compliance, providing assurance services to over 400 clients in more than 46 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. The firm has over 10 years of experience in compliance with frameworks such as HIPAA, HITECH, ISO 27001, and NIST. We offer regulatory compliance services as well as information security services. Our regulatory compliance services consist of consulting, such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, and internal audit plan development. We also perform readiness audits. We offer information security guidance and audit services on frameworks such as HIPAA, SOC 2, SSA 16, PCI DSS, FISMA, and ISO 27001. I also want to encourage everyone on the webinar today to take a minute to connect with us. You can subscribe to our blog from the link there on the screen. We post regular industry updates, tips, and best practices, and it's a great way to receive some free educational resources. We also keep a library of our pre-recorded webinars on our website. We have several popular webinar series that I encourage you to check out. And you can also connect with us on LinkedIn to stay updated on upcoming webinars, events, and industry news. Without any further hesitation, I want to welcome our speaker today, Jesse Skippy. Jesse has over 12 years of experience, and as Vice President of the Strategic Development and Chief Compliance Officer for KirkpatrickPrice, she is focused on assisting clients in meeting regulatory compliance and information security objectives. Jesse has several certifications. She is an ACA Certified Credit and Collections Compliance Officer. She has the ACA Scholar designation. She's a Certified Information Systems Security Professional and a DBA Certified Receivables Compliance Professional. So at this time, I'll turn it over to you, Jesse. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody, again, for attending. As you'll see there on my short little bio, I do have a lot of experience in credit and collections industry in compliance, but something you may not know about me is that about 2005, I think June of 2005 is when I first became a CISSP. So I have about 11-year background in information technology and security, and I remember when I decided to become a CISSP, it was because of, I was serving as director of IT for the company I was working for, and we started getting, all of these questionnaires from the banks we were doing business with, and they all wanted, different questions to be addressed. And even back then, they weren't really coming on site to do the visits that they are today. So times have sure changed, and companies have matured with their programs over the years. And I'm very excited to present this topic today because ISO 27001 is a management framework. So if you're here today to hear a highly technical presentation, you may want to hang up now because it's not technical. It's about management. It's about management of information security and how to, put the right controls in place based on risk. So any of you that are listening, and I did see several of the attendees today do have that compliance function within their company, or maybe you are executive management of the company and you're considering ISO. This presentation is really about an overall intro, to the standard and how you may be able to apply it to your business. So we can go on and get started with the next slide. So as I mentioned, today is going to be an overview of the ISO 27001 standard. So I'm going to kind of take you through, what is it, why is it important? Maybe you're listening today because someone that you're in a business relationship with has asked you, are you ISO compliant or can you become ISO compliant and you're looking at the possibility, or maybe you're part of the way in it and you're trying to figure out how to get yourself across the finish line. So I'm going to kind of take you through that high level, why, what is it and why is it important? And then we're going to get down to the details of the actual standards themselves. I'm going to take you through the background, give you a little history lesson, take you through the whole family of ISO standards and the structure of the ISO 27001 standard itself. And then I'm going to help you kind of, hopefully take some takeaways at the end with kind of a roadmap. So depending on where you are in the process, what do you have to do, I guess, to get to that next level. So that's my goal of the presentation today. And like Sarah mentioned, we do have time at the end scheduled for questions. So if you have questions, please use that Q&A feature. And if it's appropriate, she'll interrupt me, during the conversation, or we'll save it to the end. So we can go on to the next slide. So just to give you the background, this is like if you're brand new to ISO, who is ISO? What do they do, what do they do for us? So ISO itself is an independent, non-governmental organization, and it consists of 161 national standards bodies. So what's interesting about this is if you are conducting international business, this is a key for you for what ISO means to the world, as obviously overarching standards are created. If you go to their website, which I have a link there at the bottom where this comes from, you can take a look at the map and you can see all of the countries that are participating as members of ISO and contributing to this collection and shared knowledge. So that's where it comes from. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. And what are the standards themselves? Standards are documents that are put into place, and they just make things work. They make international trade possible. They make it so that the businesses that align internationally have a common ground, a common framework from which they can work from. So we can go on to the next slide. So more background here about the ISO 27001 standard itself. There's some confusion as far as what that actually means. A lot of times when companies say that they are compliant with the ISO standard, that can mean a lot of different things. There are approximately 21,000 different ISO standards that have been published. So it's very evident that you need to be sure what ISO standard you're talking about. And I think if you're in the credit and collections environment, or if you're in an environment where you're working with a financial institution or a bank, obviously the most common one in this realm would be 27001 or 27002. So having understanding the differences between those two, I think is very important because there are differences, and I'm going to walk you through that. 27001 that we're going to talk about today is the overarching management framework that does include Annex A, which is the listing of controls that 27002 then provides guidance for. But 27001 is what we're going to talk about today, and that is all about information security management. So it's very much covering, the management system, preserving the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information by applying risk management process and giving confidence to interested parties that risks are adequately managed, which I thought was a key statement here. So it's really all about the management structure around that. So we can go and dig in here. One thing I wanted to share with you on the next slide was in the background. Those of you that have heard a presentation that I've given before and we talk about any type of compliance management system, the same type of model exists here. This Plan, Do, Check, Act model is a continuous cycle of improvement, and that's what I want you to think about when you think about ISO 27001, because it really does, and you'll see as we dig down into the individual components of the standard how this really applies. And anyone that's listening today that has been building a compliance management system for their regulatory compliance aspect, they're going to see this is very, very familiar. This ties together so nicely as far as, having that overarching all-encompassing management program that covers information security, very similar to maybe other compliance management system processes that you have in place throughout the organization. So this plan, do, check, act model you'll see throughout the presentation, and it really does a nice, I think this is a great graphic to have you get a very quick understanding of what is ISO 27001. It includes all of these components. It includes planning and involvement from leadership and executive management. It includes the risk assessment as part of the planning. It includes, as you're performing things operationally within IT management, it includes documentation and, so that things can be monitored and checked, and then issues can be found, and you can go back to the planning phase. So it's a continuous cycle of improvement. It doesn't stop. It's never something that you're completely done with. It is a way to manage information security within your organization. So no different than other types of guidance that you'll see out there, maybe FFIEC, CFPB, or FTC-related guidance. You'll see the same type of overarching management framework being recommended to meet all different types of compliance. And I think ISO 27001 fits beautifully within that same type of model. So we can go to the next slide. So if you're sitting there thinking, why should I even consider ISO 27001? Well, hopefully what I just said would be convincing to you. But the other thing, obviously, if you're doing business internationally, it's a key because the companies that you're working with or wanting to establish a business relationship with, they would recognize the ISO 27000 series of standards as a method of managing information security. So it's recognizable across, international borders, and it is an all-encompassing gold standard, for information security management that can be used in any type of vertical. It really doesn't matter what type of business relationship you're looking for, or the people on the webinar today are here from different types of companies. This is something that can be adopted throughout many different types of organizations, many different types of verticals. So the 27001 treats the particular risks of an organization it's very customized for each organization. It's not, as you'll see, there's structure to it, but it's not black and white. It's not PCI DSS. It's not something that you have to do a very specific way. There are components that you have to do to meet compliance, but how you achieve them can vary based on the size and the scope of your organization. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It is a risk management approach that requires you to spend the right amount of time on focusing on the higher risks, and those are going to vary across different organizations. So, and the ISO 27001 provides a governance framework by which clients can manage both of their security and compliance risks. That's a given, and it opens the door to businesses for business with organizations that recognize the standard. That's kind of what I said in the very beginning. So those are some of the high-level bullet points of why you should consider ISO. As I mentioned, I know a lot of you are listening for different reasons today, but this is great too if you see the value of bringing ISO into your organization and you need to discuss that with senior level management or discuss it as a group. Maybe you're part of a board of directors, or maybe you are wanting your company to adopt ISO, but you're having some trouble getting everyone to kind of jump on board with it. I think hopefully you'll pick up some things during this presentation that will help you if that's something you're trying to drive within your company. So we can go on to the next one. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson here. And this is interesting to me too, because I mentioned to you earlier that I became a CISSP in 2005. So when I first was exposed to this standard, it was lovingly referred to as the 17799. At that time, the company I worked for would make the claim that they were compliant with ISO, and technically they were, because we adapted all of the 17799 controls into our information security program. We weren't necessarily abiding by all of the management around it, but the controls themselves were in place. So I think number one thing that I want everyone to take away from today is that 27001 is not the 17799 or the 27002 controls. It is the management framework around those controls, and it is the risk assessment components and the reporting to management and the internal audit, all of those things that you must do to effectively manage information security. So part one is kind of reversal, because there's actually two parts to this in the history of how this came together. But part 1 is actually the control. So if you look at the bottom there, in 2013, it was actually revised as 27002, which I said is the guidance on the controls in Annex A. But this is kind of gives you, it's been around for a while. 1985 is when it was first published by BSI as BS 1799. It was adopted by ISO in 2000, and then in 2007, it became part of the 27000 series. So that's a little bit of a history and a little bit of a background on that component of it. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you part 2, which is now what we're really talking about today, 27001. It started off in 1999, published by BSI as BS 7799-2. And then in 2005, it became part of the 27000 series. And then right now, the most current version is the 27001-2013 version, which is what my webinar obviously is based on today, and it is what is currently available. So we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to kind of give you an idea of the ISO family. As I mentioned, there are obviously many of these, over 20,000 of these. But the ones we're talking about that are most relevant to the 27000 series are listed here. The most popular being 27001. And then the other one that's really noteworthy is at the bottom there, 27005. The Information Security Risk Management Guidance. That is something we're going to get more into in the next, I think 2 weeks is our next ISO webinar, where we're going to really kind of take you through what does that art of performing that risk assessment kind of look like. So that is the most noteworthy, but as you can see here, there are many different standards and how they all work together to formulate the ISO 27000 series family here. So you can go to the next slide. So now I'm going to dig into the structure. So if you have the ISO standard, or if it's something that you haven't went out and got yet, you can obviously buy that directly from the ISO website. But so I'm going to take you through the structure of the standard and kind of take you step by step through what each individual section means and how you can apply it to your business. So we can get started with the next slide, which talks about the introduction section, section 0. And you've seen this slide earlier in the presentation, and it really just does give an overview of what the 27001 is, what it's designed to do, and what makes it important and what really sets the stage for the rest of the document. So the purpose is to provide requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving an information security management system. Pretty plain and simple. And to give that confidence to interested parties that risks are being adequately managed. And as you'll see as I dig into this, it does take into consideration that you should, as part of your management system, take into consideration the requirements of interested parties. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the scope section on the next slide. So this just sets the scope for the standard itself. Not anything too groundbreaking here, just an overview of what the scope of the document is. This is not necessarily related to scoping your environment, but necessarily scoping your compliance with the ISO standard. So see if there's anything noteworthy that I want to talk about here. The requirements for assessment and treatment of information security risk tailored to the needs. So this is basically just, again, talking about the overarching components of 27001. So we can go to the next slide. And again here, I'm just going to kind of breeze through some of these sections because they're very, very short in the standard itself and nothing too noteworthy. But here I thought was an interesting way they lay this out, because Section 2 and Section 3 are the normative references and the terms and definitions, and they define it very clearly in the document that you cannot use this standard without also using 27000, which is the overview and vocabulary, and then the terms and definitions. So there are other documents that relate to it, and it's saying that without it, the subject technical standard cannot be fully and properly utilized without also understanding the terms and definitions that are outlined in 27000. So it's important when you begin your process of becoming ISO 27001, if you're going for certification or if you are just wanting to be compliant with the standard, that you maintain copies and get familiar with 27,000, 27,001, and 27,002, because they're all obviously going to work well together in meeting your compliance objectives. So we can go on to the next slide. So the context of the organization, I think this is important because this talks about becoming compliant with ISO 27001 standard requires an understanding of the organization and its context. So what does that mean? I think this is about, well, I know this is about setting kind of the scope of your compliance. So it's about determining external and internal issues that are relevant to the purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcome. So why are you doing this, basically? It's about having an understanding of why you're doing this. Are there any interested parties that are contributing to what your overall compliance objectives are? All of that should be taken into consideration when you're working towards compliance. It's necessary for understanding what your business risks are and having that scoped out within policies and procedures and within the overall communication of the program is going to just help set the scope and help set the stage for why you're doing what you're doing and communicating with employees, why it's important, and setting some boundaries. So if it's something that is not considered in the scope of what you're managing as part of this management program, it should be understood by those reading documents and those understanding what your scope and what your boundaries are to to make sure that that's communicated. So we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Now this is important too. This is leadership, because I don't see this happening on a great scale, I guess, with a lot of the companies that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. And I think this is really important. And it would be an obstacle, not necessarily an obstacle, but it may be something that in smaller organizations would possibly struggle with. But at the same time, maybe not as much, because leadership is a lot of times involved in those daily conversations. But this requires a little bit more of a formal approach to leadership commitment. This is that, very similar to what we talk about in building other types of compliance programs, the tone at the top. It's that leadership commitment. It's, board of directors and senior level management, making sure that they are approving and setting policies and that they're requiring accountability by those that are actually managing information security. So, formalizing that with roles, responsibilities, assigning, very formal authorities. And I say that with smaller companies, they may struggle because a lot of that's done informally. It's the owner of the company that's, having a chat with the IT and the security people, and they're just making changes in their they're maybe not documenting everything. So this is about formalizing that leadership, setting that tone at the top, and to make sure that the direction that's being set by leadership is that's being communicated throughout the organization. So if the organization decides that ISO 27001 is the method that they want to follow for information security management, leadership has to be involved. They have to have they have to play a part in the overall compliance because it's important. As you can see here, it's definitely one of the first components that they start with. So, if you're an individual information security person or you're in charge of IT, it's nearly impossible to implement ISO 27001 unless you have that buy-in and that support from the leadership team is really what I was trying to say there. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide there. So planning. If you remember in my plan, do, check, act model, obviously planning is at the very top. So this planning process is about making sure that you have the right processes in place to address risks and opportunities. It's about planning the organization must plan appropriately by using issues identified in 4.1 and the requirements in 4.2. So just to kind of reiterate what those were, that's about the determining external and internal issues that are relevant to the purpose that affects the ability to achieve the intended outcome. So are there any external or internal issues that are going to get in your way of achieving your objective? And 4.2 is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. So reiterating again, the planning phase of addressing risks should have an understanding of what are your internal and external issues and what are those issues that are being brought into the fold by interested third parties. So maybe it's a client relationship that has very specific expectations. Those all have to be considered in this planning phase and obviously in the risk assessment phase. So the thing that I wanted to really point out here too, in the planning phase is where Annex A kind of comes into play, because this is where it walks you through, and you know, to avoid any you know, plagiarism issues, there were things that I avoided, you know, kind of copying and pasting into the presentation from the ISO standard. You know, when you do purchase it, it's a one license. So anyway, there's something that I wanted to point out, though, in Annex A here that relates to 6.13. When you're doing in the planning phase is where you must compare the controls with what you've determined in 6.13 and make sure that the Annex A is evaluated to make sure that the controls have been omitted or accepted based on need. So this is where you perform that. It's a statement of applicability where you look at Annex A and you determine if there's something that is being omitted, there needs to be a reason why. So this is where in the planning phase you would take a look at that Annex A, and we're going to talk a lot more about Annex A here in a few minutes, so I don't want to leave you hanging on that one. But so Annex A again is the controls. Those controls are then, you have a lot more guidance on those controls in 27002. So Annex A is just simply the list of those controls. But here in the planning phase, you would go through and you would produce a statement of applicability based on Annex A, and if there was something that is omitted, maybe something isn't applicable. Maybe you're not, you know, performing you know, software development, for example. So that would be a great example of why something within Annex A would not be applicable to your business, and you would, in this planning phase, you would produce that statement of applicability that would define what is applicable and what is not and why it's not. So we can go on to the next slide. So 7 is support. And this is important because, as I just mentioned, you know, if you are trying to push forward an implementation of ISO 27001, you really can't do it without support of, you know, your senior leadership and without the appropriate resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continuous improvement of the information security management system. So this is where, you know, this is a company-wide effort. This is not one person you know, pushing this through. This is making sure that leadership is on board, you know, you have the necessary resources and you have the necessary support to carry out this management system. The competence section, which is a requirement that the organization has to have a person managing the program that is competent. So they are, and that is measured based on the education, training, and experience of the people that are assigned as management of the program. So you do have to have continuing education, and you do have to be educated enough to understand how to manage the program. So it's all about awareness, communication, and documented information too. So the support is the section there, which I'm really just briefly touching on here, goes into how do you make employees aware, how are you communicating information, and how are you documenting. So this, again, has very strong ties into what we have talked about in a lot of our Kirkpatrick-Price webinars about compliance management systems, about making employees aware. You know, having that documentation at their, you know, so that they can bring it up, they can look at it, they can have it as part of their daily lives or their daily work process, and that, you know, information is communicated to them. So we can go on to the next slide. So it's covering operations. So section 8 is about, okay, now you've done the planning and you've done, you know, you're ready to do your risk assessment and you're ready to have these controls in operational order. So the most important thing to know about the operational phase is, you know, documentation must be maintained to demonstrate that plans have been carried out. Now, this is really critical because it's not only just following the controls, it's being able to produce evidence that those controls are functioning properly. So performing the risk assessment, having the policies and procedures, identifying those controls that are high risk, and identifying that risk treatment plan, which I kind of glazed over earlier, and I apologize, but the risk treatment plan is so critical here because it's not only about just performing the risk assessment, it's how are you going to carry through and treat those risks. So as IT operations continues, thinking of how are you going to manage and make sure that there is documentation, there's evidence to show that this risk treatment plan is in place and it's functioning. Alrighty, let's see if there's anything else I want to say. This is hard doing webinar by myself because I usually have at least one other person to to talk to, so I hope I'm not boring everyone to sleep here. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So performance evaluation. This, again, continues that cycle as I was just describing, that the controls that are in place operationally. This stage, this performance evaluation, is where things are monitored. This is where monitoring is required. So if it is a high-risk item, it is on your risk assessment as high risk. It is on your risk treatment plan with some very specific controls of how you're going to mitigate that risk. This is where that is evaluated. So monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation, this is where that monitoring takes place so that you can determine how to make the necessary corrective actions going forward. This is continuous cycle of improvement. So if something is not quite mitigating the risk the way you had intended it to, this is about finding where those issues are and finding new issues and, continuing to implement the controls that are necessary to maintain information security. So there's an internal audit component here. So we're talking about independent internal audit, and then, of course, management review of those findings. So management review of, what was the control that was monitored, what was found as far as monitoring results or audit results, and what is the corrective action. So that type of performance evaluation is what this Section 9 is really all about. It's the check phase. It's communicating with executive management because they have that responsibility, as we talked about earlier in leadership, to review the organization's information security management plan and review those monitoring results to make sure that everything is in place as designed and it's operating effectively. So let's see. So the management review shall include consideration of, and I have a few bullet points I wanted to share with you here, the status of action from previous management reviews. So if a management review is performed, they want to know, was the remediation performed successfully and what is the status? So changes in external and internal issues that are relevant to the information security management system. So that type of report being produced to top level management should include changes. It should include nonconformities and corrective actions. It should include monitoring and measurement results and audit results. So this is very familiar to some of you that have been providing reports to the board that maybe cover other compliance areas. So this is very much the same type of logic, but performed for information security. So we can go on to the next slide. Which is improvement. Okay, so here again, I wanted to show you that continuous cycle of improvement again, because we've gone through plan, we've gone through the do, we've gone through check, and improvement is really the act phase, because this is where you've reviewed the outcome of your monitoring and your audit efforts, and you have to put forward a corrective action plan. So identifying any of those nonconformities, and putting together an action plan and creating that continuous improvement cycle. So you're back to the planning, how could I have planned for this differently? How do I need to make some changes to my, to my risk assessment, to my risk treatment plan, and onward and forward through the cycle of continuous improvement. So the organization shall continuously improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the information security management system. So that's really what it's all about, and this improvement is the last component of the ISO standard, and it really does just loop you right back to the beginning. So it's that continuous cycle of improvement as you're managing your information security program. So we can go on to the next slide. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Annex A, because I do feel like it's commonly misunderstood what that is there for and what it means. It's directly derived from and aligns with those controls listed in 27002. So the control itself is listed in Annex A. The how-to, or the guidance on implementation of the control, is in 27002. So they very directly are tied together and align. Annex A, as I just mentioned, defines the control, and 27002 provides the guidance, and controls are not mandatory, and they're not going to be applicable to everyone. Like again, I said, this is not a black and white framework to follow. This is it has to be something that's relevant to your business. I know a lot of companies that are managing ISO 27001 as an overarching way to manage information security. They may also be PCI compliant, so incorporating your PCI compliance requirements into this type of management system is perfectly fitting, because of course, there's a lot of controls within PCI, or whether you have a SOC 2 or you're following an SSA 16 or HIPAA, regardless of the information security framework that you've chosen to follow thus far, you're going to be able to incorporate that into this management framework because of that ability to bring in like I said earlier, the requirements of the interested parties, the external and the internal threats that you have. PCI would be very fitting to fold into the mix of this overarching ISO 27001 management program, because there are, monitoring requirements that align, and it's just a way of bringing in all of those things that are important to your business and figuring out how are you going to manage that. And I think if I was sitting on the board of directors, or I was, the president or CEO of a company, I would want to know, how is my IT team or my information security team, how are they managing all these requirements, and can I see some reports of audit and monitoring efforts? So I think it fits really nicely with what, you would want to see at that management level of the company. So I've really kind of gone above and beyond my discussion here for Annex A, but I did really want to highlight that last statement there. It's the controls are not mandatory, and not all of them will be applicable. And you may have additional controls within your ISO 27001 management framework because of things that you're doing that are maybe outside of what Annex A may cover. So we can go to the next slide, and I will show you a little bit more detail about what Annex A does cover, and there's many, many more. This is just a kind of a high-level snapshot of some of them. And I think most of these are going to be very, very familiar to everyone listening in. So the information security policies, those are controls on how policies are written and reviewed. A6 is organization of information security, controls on how the responsibilities are assigned. A7 is human resources security, so controls, prior to employment, drug screening, background check, those types of requirements during and after the employment. Asset management, how are you controlling your inventory of assets, acceptable use and classification and media handling. A9 covers access control, controls for access control policy, user acceptance management, basically your logical control requirements. So again, nothing brand new here in Annex A. Hopefully anything I said here is nothing new to anyone listening, but it's just a way of managing those as controls. And again, 27002 would give you all the guidance that you would need. Well, it would give you some guidance on how to implement those controls. I mean, not all you need, but excuse me. So we can go on to the next slide here, because I wanted to do is give you kind of a roadmap. So this is obviously a very high-level roadmap, but if you're listening in today and you're considering, you're like, yes, I think this is great. I would like to, implement ISO 27001 in your organization, or maybe someone has already told you that you have to do that and you want to know where to start. So again, as I said earlier, I would start with the board of directors and top-level management. Their commitment is absolutely critical. There's support that you need. There is direction and guidance from them that you need, and it's the place to start. So purchasing a copy of the standard, I have the link there for how you actually go to the ISO website and actually purchase the standards that you need. Starting with the risk assessment, you really can't go any farther until you complete that risk assessment piece, because you have to understand, what are those internal and those external risks, what are those needs from interested parties, how are you going to put that all together in a risk assessment so that you can then create your risk treatment plan. So you have to start with the risk assessment. And then in that process, you're determining how Annex A controls will mitigate and help control the risk identified. And from there, developing policies and procedures around those controls. I mean, policies and procedures themselves are an administrative control, but what are those things that you need to define within the procedures that incorporate, detective controls or preventative controls? How are you? Those are the first step of creating a preventative control, because you need to educate those people that are reading the procedures and the policies. So that would be the next step. And then, of course, communicating those and providing training on those to the employees. And then look at performing an independent internal audit or hire a professional. And my very funny term here is, where can I find one of those? I'm going to tell you more about that in just a minute. And then determine if ISO certification is right for you. ISO 27001 is a certifiable, is that the right word? You can obtain ISO 27001 certification from a certification body. What I wanted to share with you here too is interesting, because since 2007, an average of 100 companies became certified. So every year, between the numbers that I had were from 2014 to 2007, about an average of 100 companies become certified. So right now, the last statistics that I had was there's approximately 664 companies that are certified for ISO 27001. And I think that's interesting, because I would still consider that to be a fairly low number. But what I think is telling, though, is how it's increasing year over year. It's since it became a standard that you can obtain certification on, it has grown substantially. So I definitely see that trending upwards as far as companies that are working towards certification. So we can go on to the next slide. So what I wanted to share with you is obviously what can Kirkpatrick Price deliver, what can we do for you to help you with your 27001 process. So the things that we can offer as a firm, and I know pretty much any of the components that we've taken you through are available on a consulting basis. But the most common thing that we're asked to help with is that risk assessment. For whatever reason, risk assessment is kind of a gray cloud to some people, or it's just too time-consuming. And in that case, we can come in. We can't do the risk assessment for you, because those risks are internal to your company and only you understand those. But what we absolutely do is come in and guide you through the process. So we act as project manager. We develop the risk matrix, and we fill out, we basically complete the risk assessment with your help. We come in, we ask a lot of questions, and we basically guide you through that process. We can also come in and do a 27002 control assessment. Many of our clients hire us for this today. So we can come in and do an attestation of compliance to the 27002 controls that, as I mentioned, are also defined in Annex A. We have helped companies develop policies and procedures getting ready for ISO certification or ISO compliance. We can also provide you with the Information Security Officer Advisory Service as you're working your way through this. And the gap assessment and the pre-audit, if you're working with if you're working towards certification and you want to make sure that you are ready for that certification audit, hiring a firm like ours to come in to perform that audit prior to the certification audit is very helpful and most commonly done. So I wanted to at least give you an idea of the things that we are working on as a firm to help you prepare for ISO 27001 certification. So we can go on to the next slide, and I think this is a duplication. So let's go ahead and skip this and go on to the questions. See if we have any questions from anybody in the audience today.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. First, I just want to let everyone know that we will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck from today's presentation. So look for that later this afternoon. So someone that has asked the question, is Annex A part of ISO 27001 or 27002?
Annex A is actually part of 27001. It's embedded within the standard itself, and it does, like I mentioned before, it directly ties into 27002. 27002 goes into each control in a lot more detail, but Annex A itself is a component of 27001.
Great. Okay. We also have someone else asking about a sample SOA document, and specifically, is it a spreadsheet style document or a different type of document?
Well, it's one of those things that's open for interpretation. Again, this is not a black and white framework. The fact is, the requirement is that you do it, is that you define when something's not applicable. I think in all practical sense, to me, that looks like an Excel spreadsheet, but there are different tools and things that you can use to create other types of document that are acceptable as well.
All right, it looks like those are the only questions that have come through. So if you have any other questions after we log off today, feel free to reach out to Jessie. Her contact information is there on the screen, and we will answer any other questions that you'll have. And at this time, I would also like to welcome you to go on and register for the next webinar in the ISO 27001 Readiness Series, which will be covering risk management. And that will be June 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 2 weeks from today. And there's a link to go on and register for that on the screen. And Jessie, did you have anything else before we end the session today?
I don't think so. Thank you, Sarah.
All right, thank you. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you next time.